Thank you. Good morning, everyone. As you said, my name is Meg Appelgate, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Unsilenced. Everyone hear me okay? Okay, cool. First of all, yeah, something's weird. I'm not catching. First of all, I wanted to get a quick poll. Raise your hand if you have ever heard of Unsilenced. Oh, that's awesome. Oh, there's one. I see one. That's really, oh, two. That's good. That's really exciting. Okay. Another thing about today, anyone, please raise your hand if you have an issue with live streaming, being on camera at all, pictures, anything like that. If you do, please raise your hand. We'll just make sure to not get you in any pictures. I figured. Okay. So also with me here today is Nicole Pindur, who is within our advocacy division at Unsilenced. And we also have Katherine McNamara, who is our director of IT, and they are both survivors as well. So am I. Unsilenced is a nonprofit organization that serves the past, present, and future victims of institutional child abuse. Our mission is to stop institutional child abuse by empowering self-advocates to promote lasting social change. This is going in and out. I don't know what's going on. I can try. It's throwing me off.
That's why I don't use it.
Yeah, it's like... You might want to go up on it, because I could barely hear you. There you go. Testing. Oh my gosh, that's so much better. Okay, so before I dive into the areas that Unsilenced makes its impact and the industry that we're up against, I think it makes the most sense to start off with a little bit about me, my story, and why I care so much about this topic. On the slide above, you'll find a QR code that's going to take you to all of my contact information, actually also my socials. If you have any questions after this presentation, please feel free to contact me and ask me. So before I start, I do, however, need to give a trigger warning for this entire presentation, which is also going to include a short movie, because there will be mentions of physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, along with photos that could be really triggering to some. If at any time you feel as though you need to remove yourself, please do. When I was 15 years old, I was kidnapped from my bed in the middle of the night by two strangers. They told me that I was coming with them and we can do this the easy way or the hard way. I chose the easy way. They then forced me into the back of an SUV and drove off. This was effectively the end of my childhood. Over the course of the next 3.5 years, I was abused in 2 different facilities that masqueraded as being my treatment. During this treatment, I experienced things like isolation, seclusion from society, incorrect diagnoses, and forced medication, name-calling and belittlement in front of my peers, forced labor to the point of injury, medical neglect, 8 to 16 hours of attack therapy every week, the removal of food and essential items as punishment, and inappropriate physical and emotional relationship dynamics between my therapist and myself. I left the programs brainwashed at the age of 18.5, and I didn't wake up to the abuse that I experienced until I was 33, when a program friend of mine committed suicide. Because of these experiences, I now suffer from complex post-traumatic stress disorder, daily anxiety attacks, panic attacks, disassociation, chronic health issues from the medical neglect, and insomnia. I wish I could say that my story isn't common, but it is. Hundreds of thousands of people are out there with the same or similar story to mine. In fact, I'm going to hand it over to Katherine McNamara and Nicole Pindur right after, so that they can take you down the road of what their experience was like in their programs.
Hi, I'm Katherine McNamara. During the day, I'm a technical solutions architect in cybersecurity for a multinational figure out if I was gay or not. And my parents didn't really understand what was going on with me. I was depressed, I was mouthing off, and one day I got sent away to a place called Provoking School. And some of you guys might have actually heard of that because of Paris Hilton. I was there with Paris Hilton, and I was in the documentary This Is Paris about that. I was there for a year for just being depressed and struggling with who I was. And I got out, and again, I fell back into being confused. And this time I was upset, angry, institutionalized, didn't know how to adjust to the real world outside of seeing people essentially medically tortured and emotionally abused day in, day out. And I got sent away again because I got mouthy again, and I, acted out again.
It's not going to be that orange, is it?
No, which was unregulated and absolutely horrible. I watched kids be treated like absolute garbage for 6 months until I got sent away again to Provoking School, where I waited, on stage until I was 18 years old. After I turned 18, I pretty much buried it, didn't think about it again, and I just tried to repress it. I went from a kid who never would have thought of trying drugs to partying a bit through my 20s, just trying to bury it again. And then I finally got my act together around my mid-20s and just, buried myself in work and my career. And it wasn't until I was, 30-something years old when a friend of mine who I knew from the program who didn't deal with it as well as I did by burying it, committed suicide. And I woke up in 2017 and started doing activism. And I realized I had a lot of stuff that I needed to process, but unfortunately, because a lot of the abuse was, brought on, in the need of therapy, I didn't go to a therapist until I was in my late 30s. And when I did, I started to actually process this stuff and realize how wrong it was. So this is where I'm at. I've, done a lot in the last 6 years. I created an archive of programs because one thing my parents told me is if they had known that these programs were this bad or known some of the stories about them, they would have probably not sent me. Been involved with Meg, Unsilenced, and doing whatever I can. I still am very hyper-vigilant. I still, have a hard time sleeping full nights because, when you get kidnapped out of your bed and taken to a place in the middle of the night, even though it's your parents paying someone to do it, you still suffer from thinking you're being kidnapped. I still, have a hard time feeling safe in, environments I should feel safe in, or in relationships I still feel safe in, or like there's such thing as parental love that will still love you, and not send you away. Even though my parents and I's relationship are better now, it's, great for the bonds.
When I'm speaking in some time, can you go up and take a picture?
Just
Just like over there.
I heard Nicole as well.
Hi everyone. My name is Nicole, and I'm also a survivor, and I'm reading, so I'm not so my experience with institutional abuse actually began witnessing my brothers. My brother's 21 months younger than me, and without going too much into our upbringing or his own personal struggles, when he was 12 years old, he was hospitalized, and CPS got involved in our family as a result. It's my understanding that this heavily contributed to my parents' decision to send him away. And during this point, I was suffering from major depressive symptoms, anxiety, and an untreated eating disorder. I went from taking all honors classes with all A's to sleeping most hours of the day and doing what was referred to as home hospital study, in which I pretty much did all my work at home, didn't go to classes. Still, at this point, my parents were under the impression that I had hypersomnia, which is the opposite of insomnia, so I was sleeping all the time. A little under 1 year after my brother and I left, when I was 15 years old, I agreed to go to a short-term residential facility a few hours away from the Southern California town where I lived. I don't really feel like this facility benefited me in any way, and 4 weeks after being there, I woke heaven, like them, in the middle of the night to 2 grown adults physically restraining me. Still in pajamas, I was taken out to a car for an endless drive. I remember getting colder and colder as snow began to appear. I eventually found myself at a facility in Utah where I was immediately strip searched and given a rundown and needed to be immediately removed and sent to wilderness. All because I wouldn't eat a chicken quesadilla as a vegan. This last facility was in Arizona and is where I stayed the longest. It operated similarly to the former group, give and take. I spent 6 months here until I was eventually, after lots of coercion in the few times I got to speak to my parents, and no progress in my program, pulled and came home. Those next couple years at home were very turbulent. I had turned 16 in my programs, which meant I had 2 more years of living under my parents' roof with a consistent underlying fear of getting sent back. I spent those years sleeping on the floor under the dining room table where I felt the most secure. I eventually transitioned to the downstairs couch and then, after 3.5 years, a bed. But none of that stopped the recurring nightmares and chose yet again waking up in one of the facilities. In hindsight, I realized that could have been the product of being abducted from bed 3 times. Not only did my sleep quality suck, my entire quality of life sucked. I completed high school through an independent study program, which meant limited social interaction. In this time, my eating disorder also spiraled like it never had before, ultimately landing me hospitalized and being told I was in danger of dying in my sleep. I remember telling my parents at the last facility I was at that I don't think I'd ever be able to forgive them if they kept me there. And for a long time, I really didn't think I'd be able to. But eventually, after my revelations, I decided I need to for myself. I never told them, but as a little over a year ago, they are forgiven. This was exactly 5 years since I re-entered the real world, and around when I got Unsilenced. Unsilenced has helped me find a sense of community among survivors who are likewise motivated to turn their pain into meaning. The change I helped create as a part of Unsilenced has fulfilled my inner child and made me feel like I have a sense of purpose when the voices of everyone who told me I wasn't good enough were so loud in my head. So now I'm going to pass it over to Meg.
Thank you, Nicole. Our journeys were one of suspense, survival, and a fight to reclaim our identity and voice from the clutches of what Unsilenced calls the troubled teen industry, or TTI for short. The TTI is a network of programs like the ones that we went to. But instead of explaining exactly what this industry is, I'm going to show you a short 5-minute movie that does a much better job at filling you in. You may be wondering, who is Unsilenced? What is the troubled teen industry, and why should I care? Every year, thousands of children are sent against their will to troubled teen facilities, often ripped out of their beds in the middle of the night by strangers to be treated for various mental illnesses, addiction issues, and perceived behavioral problems. The troubled teen industry, or TTI, is a multi-billion-dollar industry comprised of a network of underregulated and powerful congregate care facilities that go by a myriad of names like therapeutic boarding schools, residential treatment centers, wilderness therapy programs, faith-based academies, and conversion therapy programs. They use tough love and other non-evidence-based interventions to reform youth struggling with mental health or educational challenges. These facilities use deceptive marketing to manipulate decision-makers in communities into believing they are providers of therapeutic services for at-risk youth. By pathologizing normal teenage behaviors to scared and vulnerable caregivers, they convince them their teens are at risk of great harm. They then promise to fix an impossibly long list of issues using a one-size-fits-all approach that ends up causing more harm than good. Facilities within the TTI can cost caregivers anywhere from $5,000 to $30,000 a month, but the program affects far more families than those who can afford that hefty price tag. The industry also preys on disadvantaged youth by tapping into public funds to house migrant children and youth from foster care systems, juvenile justice systems, and school systems through IEPs. In fact, it's estimated that $23 billion of your tax dollars go toward funding these facilities annually. Many youth sent to facilities already have prior trauma histories, including adoption, parental divorce, abuse, or a prior sexual assault, which are only exacerbated by extended separation from support systems and communities once placed in an institutional setting. The industry's historic lack of regulation, transparency, and accountability has led to a clear pattern of abuse spanning over the past 50 years. Instead of providing therapeutic services and education, young people often experience life-altering maltreatment, including forced labor, inadequate education, psychological harm, sexual and physical assault, neglect, civil rights violations, hospitalizations, and even death. To date, there have been over 350 documented youth who have died at the hands of this industry. Unfortunately, even in the absence of overt abuse in facilities, the act of being institutionalized itself can be harmful because the youth live under a total institution where they lose autonomy. Their contact with the outside world is restricted. They're unable to advocate for themselves, report abuse, and are forbidden to freely leave the facility for months to years, completely isolated from their community and families. This antiquated tough love approach of being removed from the home goes against what we know now. Youth with strong and cohesive relationships with family continue to experience mental health benefits, including lower levels of depressive symptoms until their late 30s. The research is clear. Forcing young people out of their communities, labeling them as the problem, and creating a residential melting pot of youth who are struggling and calling it treatment isn't working. It is actually causing harm. One study of youth with emotional and behavioral disorders illustrated how 60% of young people had a reduction of symptoms when treated within their communities, but only 11% had reductions of symptoms when treated in residential care. Many youth leaving TTI facilities grow up to struggle with trauma disorders, fractured familial relationships, and have difficulty obtaining further schooling or maximizing career opportunities due to their educational setbacks. Regardless of the name or location of facilities, many have patterns of rampant abuse, and the 120 to 200,000 children who attend them annually leave calling themselves survivors. At that rate, there is a high probability that someone you know has been to one. As more and more survivors emerge from this industry, they are beginning to speak out about their experiences. Unsilenced was founded by survivors and allies aiming to stop institutional child abuse in congregate care facilities. We envision a world where youth are free from institutionalization and the voices of young people are respected in the development of their mental, emotional, and physical well-being. Serving past, present, and future survivors of this industry, we advocate for constructive alternatives that circumvent the troubled teen industry's programs. By utilizing education, awareness, community support, and policy change, we strive to protect the civil, social, and human rights of youth. The abuse must stop. And it stops with us. We are Unsilenced. Learn more about our fight for youth rights by visiting unsilenced.org. I know what many of you may be thinking. Wait, what? I know there was a lot to digest in such a short period of time. So I'm going to dive in a little deeper and break it down so we can fully understand this industry, its history, its intentions, and how it's failing the youth of our nation. Having seen what you just saw, we now know that the troubled teen industry is a network of powerful and punitive congregate care facilities that claim to reform struggling youth by way of behavior modification. We also learned that the troubled teen industry is estimated to have a revenue of $23 billion in public funds. In fact, according to 2020 data released by the Justice Policy Institute, the average state cost for the confinement of a young person is now up to $588 a day, or $214,620 per year. And while a lack of required reporting makes it difficult to count, approximately 120,000 to 200,000 youth are being housed in these facilities annually. Now, before going any deeper into this topic, I want to do a quick poll. So please pull out your devices. We're going to be doing some questions on Mentimeter and spend the next couple minutes with that. But please keep in mind that while we may be using Mentimeter and asking these questions, every question is completely anonymous and only the answer will be recorded and not tied to your name. There are the instructions in case anyone needs the QR code to get to it. So the first question is, have you ever heard of the troubled teen industry before today? Wow. Wow, okay. Have we all finished that? You can go ahead if you're still thinking about it. Have you ever had someone you know sent to a program within the troubled teen industry? Wow. okay? Were you ever in a troubled teen industry program? Okay. If you went to a program, did you find it helpful? Okay. Okay. Oh, good. Get some contrast. Love it. Okay. All right, so regardless of whether or not people have ever heard of this industry before, we find that most people are surprised to find out that this industry actually has roots that trace back to a controversial and dangerous cult called Synanon that started in 1958. And yep, you heard me correctly, a cult. Synanon was an offshoot of Alcoholics Anonymous and had a controversial therapy that they dubbed the game, which involved verbal attacks and berating other members for the purpose of breaking them down emotionally. The game is the roots of the attack therapy that I mentioned in my program and is extremely common throughout this entire industry. Members of Synanon were also forced to shave their heads, mate with people who weren't their spouse, and even had forced sterilizations and abortions. Synanon evolved into what is considered one of the most dangerous cults in history. Synanon eventually disbanded, but not before the true believers in Synanon went on to form their own abusive spin-off programs. In the late 1960s, the birth of modern-day wilderness programs started from a survival course taught at BYU. This evolved into programs like Challenger Foundation. But with that evolution came more expensive costs and way more punitive. And it didn't take long before these wilderness programs started leading to tragic deaths due to falling, abuse, medical neglect, and simple things like dehydration. A former Synanon member founded Sea-Doo Schools in 1967, and this marked the emergence of therapeutic boarding schools, group homes, and behavior modification programs. Sea-Doo adopted Synanon's confrontational tactics, but also introduced other controversial tactics like forced cuddling. Then, the federal government provided Florida with a grant to start the SEED, which was established in 1970. The purpose of this grant was to take Synanon methods, but then apply them to teenagers. Unfortunately, the SEED took the abuse to a whole new level, and they faced criticism for employing brainwashing techniques. In fact, in a 1974 Senate report, these brainwashing techniques were compared to those used on prisoners of war in Korea. This report, along with a suspiciously high suicide rate and facing a 7-figure legal judgment, caused the SEED to collapse. Due to the bad publicity surrounding the SEED, a SEED supporter, Mel Sembler, decided to start a copycat program in 1976 under a different name, Straight Incorporated. Straight Incorporated claimed to rehabilitate teenage drug users by use of coercive thought reform methods, such as public humiliation and sleep deprivation. Straight Incorporated have heavy political ties. In fact, Mel Sembler was a family friend of the Bush family, and First Lady Nancy Reagan declared it her favorite anti-drug program. However, many of the youth that went into this program never used drugs at all, and they never offered counseling or therapy at all. There are, of course, other types of programs, such as religious academies and boot camps, that have different origin stories. But one thing remains the same. Regardless of how these programs were founded, many have patterns of rampant abuse and claim to fix struggling youth using a foundation of ineffective and non-evidence-based practices. So now we're going to go back to Mentimeter again, so we can pull out the devices. And on the screen, you're going to see 10 possible behaviors or lived experiences listed in multiple choice form. I would like everyone to check off the ones that they feel they went through as an adolescent. There's no limit to the number of behaviors or experiences you check. I checked them all, not gonna lie on that one. So please check the ones that you feel apply to you. Again, it's completely anonymous, nothing is tied to your name. Wow. Wow. Okay. The reason we just took that Mentimeter is to highlight a very tragic fact. The industry's true motives become evident when we examine the reasons why youth end up in these facilities. These programs market themselves as providers of therapeutic treatment for a wide range of mental health and perceived behavioral issues. And the reasons listed above are the most common reasons we see kids entering the industry. Ironically, you will notice that these are almost identical to the types of questions we just asked you on Mentimeter. Look at the high rate that we had of all those behaviors by everyone in the room. That is not because most of you are troubled teens, were troubled teens, by the way. It's because most of these are very normal teenage behaviors. These programs have a pattern of pathologizing normal teenage behaviors and making the parents believe that there's something that needs to be fixed. And for the youth who are experiencing legitimate conditions requiring mental health treatment, caregivers are oftentimes given misinformation about the severity of that child's behavior and fail to mention that data supports that long-term residential care is often unnecessary and can be harmful. The times that inpatient care may be necessary is during times of extreme crisis to stabilize patients. But the actual percentage of youth needing this level of intervention is far lower than the numbers we see entering the troubled teen industry. This indicates a grave misunderstanding among the general public about when inpatient care is truly needed and a trend of programs convincing the public it's necessary when it's not. According to their theories of adolescent behavior and these poll results, all of you were troubled teens that needed to go to a troubled teen program, which is obviously ridiculous. There are many pipelines that youth can enter this industry, and they're influenced by a multitude of ways. But here are the main ones: caregiver placement and education consultants, judicial systems and child welfare, school systems through things like IEPs, medical and mental health care professionals. The answer to how so many children end up in these programs lies in deceptive marketing and fear-mongering tactics used by programs to prey on vulnerable caregivers and decision makers. Many programs even have quizzes online to help parents identify if they have a troubled teen. But these quizzes are designed to mislead parents. One example is Shepherd's Hill Academy, which you'll see above. To illustrate my point, I took their 10-question quiz as a prospective parent. But instead of indicating my teen had issues with what they are suggesting, I put disagree to indicate that my hypothetical child does not have the behaviors that they are labeling as high risk. Even with indicating that my child had none of the high-risk behaviors, their results still indicate, and I quote, "It sounds like your teenager is experiencing moderate to high levels of disobedience, anger, or risky behavior." And of course, it goes on to say that Shepherd's Hill Academy has the solutions to all of my problems. So using only 10 vague questions, they're recommending a 12-month plus residential treatment program for a teen they have never met, and without asking any medical or mental health questions at all. I have to add that this specific program has had many allegations of misconduct, including abuse, conversion therapy, continued failed inspections every year, and even operated unsupervised and without a license for over 10 years. And even in the absence of deceptive online quizzes, if you end up on a phone call with a program as a caregiver needing help, they'll use therapeutic buzzwords like CBT, DBT, and trauma-informed care as a way to draw you in. And they will work hard to convince you that if you don't do something now, your child will be a lost cause, and promise that they have the answers to fix them. This fear-mongering pushes parents to feel the need to make their decisions quickly, not have enough time to do their due diligence, and to feel like this program will be the answer to their prayers. Most tragically, it gives the parents the false sense of feeling like they are no longer alone, and that this program will be on their team in providing for their child. And instead of delivering individualized evidence-based treatment, many of these programs deliver a mix of maltreatment, such as inhumane discipline, dangerous use of seclusion and restraint, physical, medical, and nutritional neglect, sexual assault, harassment, and grooming, conversion and aversion therapy, forced medication and over-medication, isolation, inability for youth to report abuse, severe restrictions of communication with parents, lawyers, and advocates, substandard psychotherapeutic interventions and education by unqualified staff, food and sleep deprivation, and unfortunately, death. And we find that the longer youth stay in these facilities, the more likely they are to experience the abuse that I've talked about. However, as I've illustrated, an overwhelming majority of these facilities do not prioritize the patient's well-being and only focus on the profit that they can create. With insurance companies, state and federal funds, and parents paying at a per-day rate, it incentivizes programs to extend the care for as long as possible for the youth, increasing the likelihood that they'll have long-term effects for their lives. When trying to determine how the abuse in these facilities will affect children as they grow up, it's important to consider the concept of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. ACEs are potentially traumatic events that happen before a child reaches the age of 18 that can interfere with their health, opportunity, and stability throughout life. The original ACEs study and decades of research since has been able to link ACEs to greater chances of developing chronic disorders, obesity, behavioral changes, autoimmune disease, depression, and alcoholism. And they're separated into 3 categories of abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. When you take a look at the 10 questions on the ACEs questionnaire, you're going to notice that many of the questions are identical to the type of abuse I've explained goes on in these facilities. To illustrate my point further, if I had filled out an ACEs questionnaire when I was 15 before I was sent away, I would have scored a 1 out of 10. When I take it now, because of the situations I went through for 3.5 years while in my programs, I now score a 7 out of 10 for treatment. Research done in adults has shown that there is increased morbidity and mortality among those who have higher numbers of ACEs. In fact, with an ACE score of 4 or more, my likelihood of developing chronic pulmonary lung disease increases 390%, hepatitis 240%, depression 460%, and attempted suicide 1,220%. Now that we understand the effects that institutionalization and abuse can have on a child or adolescent's physical health, I want to dive into the effects that can have on their development. Because research has shown how important and critical childhood periods are on the brain. This is when the foundations of conscience, trust, empathy, impulse control, problem solving, focused learning, and attachment are being built. When ACEs occur, especially when they aren't responded to by a nurturing caregiver, it affects the neurobiology of the developing brain. This is known as toxic stress. And we know now that toxic stress affects the genetic expression within the brain in ways that actually alters its architecture in the amygdala, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex. Toxic stress has profound and lasting effects on childhood development and overall well-being. Prolonged exposure to toxic stress significantly increases the risk of both physical and mental health issues, cognitive difficulties and behavioral issues, and interpersonal difficulties, all of which hinder the formation of secure relationships and healthy communication. These behaviors often persist into adulthood and can result in risky behaviors like substance abuse, early sexual activity, delinquency, and criminal involvement if left untreated. Disturbingly, the effects of toxic stress can be passed down through generations, perpetuating the cycle of trauma and adversity. When looking at how toxic stress can affect developing children, I find it really helpful to look at the theories of Erik Erikson. Erik Erikson was a German psychologist who famously split development into 8 important psychosocial stages. Each of these stages represent an important struggle or conflict that happens during this time and will inevitably contribute to the personality as you mature. He theorizes that each of these stages is crucial to the development of one's ego and maturation in the span of your life. He also suggests that these stages actually may overlap, and that the stages in that a person doesn't master may actually end up affecting them for the rest of their lives. The stage I'm going to focus on today is stage 5, because it's the most likely stage that children will enter the programs within the troubled teen industry, as it is ages 12 through 18. In this 5th stage of identity versus role confusion, development primarily depends on experiences. This is a time when adolescents are seeking to find out who they are. They find themselves stuck between being a child and an adult, and they start to view life as more complex. They start to struggle with social interactions and feel the gravity of moral issues. The goal in this stage is for adolescents to define their personal identity outside of their family and establish themselves as members of society. It is a stage of intense exploration of personal values, beliefs, and goals. Common signs and behaviors that an adolescent is in this stage is withdrawing from responsibilities, testing limits and boundaries, more defiance, rebellious actions, refusing to do homework or chores, power struggles with adults and caregivers. Now I want to take a look and focus on these common signs. In the event that an adolescent is not afforded the ability or freedom to complete this identity and end up with role confusion, these are the possible consequences: difficulties with commitment, worse mental health, a weak sense of self, and a lack of confidence. But I'm going to take a look again at the common signs that a child has entered the 5th stage. If you read those closely, you're going to recognize them because we saw them earlier. If we take a majority of the behaviors I explained earlier that end up getting a child sent to these types of facilities on the screen, the same poll that you filled out, you're going to notice most of them line up with the behaviors that are to be expected in a youth's normal development as they try and figure out who they are. So normal, in fact, that many of the people in the room experience the very same ones. The toll that these programs have on the well-being of the youth can be horrendous. But the way that they pathologize adolescents has had a social impact that has effectively scared parents and caregivers into thinking their teens are at risk, when in fact they're just a teen. As a society, we have been labeling children as troubled and as something that needs to be fixed, and in an attempt to fix them, we're causing more harm. In fact, due to the punitive and isolative approaches utilized in these programs, it effectively creates a barrier for youth to be able to complete this psychosocial stage and sets them up for extreme disadvantages throughout their life. But we also know now that even the act of being institutionalized itself can be harmful. The youth who go into these facilities have every aspect of their lives monitored. Contact with the outside world is shut off, and have a complete loss of free will. For example, even if a program starts with the best of intentions in mind when creating the program, the very fact that communication is limited to the outside world and that there is no due process and that children are extremely removed from support systems will breed abuse even if it's not intended. And as survivors exit this industry, we have really started to understand the true and long-term effects that living in this environment can cause in adulthood, such as complex post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and personality disorders, unstable housing or homelessness, and a lack of employment and job training. They have poor educational outcomes and lack opportunities to develop critical life skills. They're more likely to become delinquent and have increased chances of suicidality. As if that wasn't enough, the troubled teen industry faces several critical challenges regarding reporting, regulation, and oversight. One major issue is the lack of uniform standards. Facilities operate under varying regulations, or sometimes no regulations at all, which leads to significant disparities in practices and levels of care. Some facilities even exploit loopholes in oversight by labeling themselves as educational institutions or religious programs, which allows them to bypass certain regulations that would typically apply to mental health treatment facilities. To further complicate things, licensing requirements for these facilities are often limited and inconsistent across states, with some jurisdictions having minimal or no specific licensure requirements at all. The lack of standardized licensing further contributes to the lack of accountability and quality control within the industry. Furthermore, inadequate reporting mechanisms hinder youth from reporting incidents of abuse because they fear retaliation and they lack proper access to communication channels. This results in a lack of comprehensive data on the actual extent of the problem. In addition to the lack of reporting, regulation, and oversight into these programs, substantial barriers exist in being able to accurately understand how many children are being funneled into this industry every year. The only way to obtain data about these placements is through data from the Interstate Compact on the Placement of Children, or ICPC. The ICPC is an agreement between all 50 states that exists for the purpose of ensuring children who are placed out of state are placed with caregivers who are safe, suitable, and able to meet the child's needs. The compact applies to children who are in custody of the state, those who are being adopted, and also those being placed in residential treatment by a caregiver. Unfortunately, acquiring the data requires doing a record request for each and every state's data across the entire US individually. And all of them come back on completely different timelines. Some states have centralized systems to track data, whereas others are decentralized, and some also may rely on more local level jurisdictions. For example, to receive ICPC data for all pipelines in California where I live, I would have to submit a request to both the Department of Social Services and Department of Education. But in other states, it may be many more agencies than that. Given the barriers to available information and the time it would take to keep up-to-date information, keeping accurate data on the placement of youth in this industry is virtually impossible. And as we examine the nation's landscape of placements, we observe a distinct division between send-out states, that you'll see in purple, and receiving states, that you'll see in orange. And it's based on the level of regulation in each state, with the states that have the least amount of regulations for children having more programs. This division raises questions about the disparities in oversight and how it might impact the well-being and safety of youth in out-of-state placements, if the reasons that more programs are in that state is solely because their laws don't protect children as much as the sending state. All these systemic challenges in regard to regulation, reporting, oversight, and tracking of youth placements highlight the need for comprehensive reform within the troubled teen industry. So now that we have a clear understanding of the troubled teen industry and the inherent challenges it poses, let's move on to what Unsilenced is doing to address this issue. We aim to stop institutional child abuse and empower survivors, and we do it in the following ways. We're dedicated to educating various decision makers and communities, including school, social, and justice systems, and medical and mental health professionals about the troubled teen industry and its harmful effects it can have on youth. We constantly expose the truth by conducting thorough investigations of programs and maintain an extensive online archive of over 100,000 documents created by Katherine McNamara. These documents contain information on over 3,500 different programs in the form of lawsuits, DHS reports, police reports, media stories, and survivor testimonies. This allows us to force transparency into an industry where it doesn't exist, so decision makers and communities can have better informed decisions for youth. In collaboration with our social media team, we ensure that all stakeholders in this industry are aware of the abuse going on and call out the bad actors and the programs when necessary. We're actively involved in partnering with and promoting community-based alternatives to institutionalization. We believe and advocate for policies that prioritize keeping young people with their families and communities whenever possible. Most importantly, Unsilenced stands alongside and supports those who have experienced institutional abuse. We connect survivors to legal support with law firms we have partnered with through our attorney database to ensure they have the resources to seek justice if they choose. We provide independence packs to survivors who age out of programs and are battling homelessness. The pack contains a laptop, essential items, and our versions of a roadmap to healing to help support them during the journey towards stability. And we offer free monthly virtual support groups to create a safe place for survivors to heal and connect with others who have had similar experiences. Overall, we are making a tangible impact by educating stakeholders, exposing the industry, advocating for reform, and supporting survivors of institutional abuse. We see evidence of that impact at the rate at which these abusive programs are shutting down. For example, during the 8-year span of 2012 to 2019, there were 153 programs that shut down. In 2020 is when the heavy advocacy work began after Paris Hilton and other high-profile celebrities came out about their experiences. And in that 3.5-year span of 2020 to current day, we have seen 158 programs close. And 71 of those programs have been closed since Unsilenced started a 1.5 years ago. This presentation today is part of our biggest initiative that we think has the power to change the world, called Project Speak. Project Speak stands for Survivor Prevention Through Education, Awareness, and Knowledge. It's an extensive network of survivors and allies who go out and they impact their communities by educating caregivers, school and judicial systems, child placing agencies, healthcare professionals, and insurance companies on the troubled teen industry. Its mission is to create awareness and transparency into the industry, the effects that it has on families and relationships, and what communities gain by supporting youth through community-based alternatives. By arming decision makers with the knowledge they need to promote equitable health, education, and treatment of youth, we can better protect the civil, social, and human rights of youth by preventing institutionalization. I know that this was probably a lot of information, and information that is likely having an emotional toll on you. But now that we're aware of an issue, what can we collectively do? It's imperative that this country begins to understand how important it is to start prioritizing not only the health and wellness of youth, but their voices as well. At this point, this is a national health crisis. And to create the impact we desire, it needs to be social change. All of you are the future leaders of this world, the future change makers. And the only way to ensure a safe future for your children and grandchildren is to act now. If you are on social media, please go follow myself and Unsilenced. We are constantly putting out the content that calls out the industry, the programs, and the bad actors in them. By sharing our content, we have a greater reach and better chance at educating the public. But the most important thing you can do when you leave here today is have a plan to have conversations about the troubled teen industry. Tell people about this industry, what you learned, and how youth are being abused under the disguise of treatment. If you have a younger sibling in high school, talk to your parents about this industry. What you tell them could help inform them enough to never fall for what this industry claims to offer and send your sibling away. Talk to your friends about this industry. At the rate that youth are funneled into this industry, chances are someone in your friend group has been to one of these facilities. And if they are one of the overwhelming number of youth exiting the industry who has had a traumatic experience, they may be suffering alone. Tell them about Unsilenced and our online community and how we help create a safe place for survivors via online groups and support groups. If you are the one who likes to take a heavy part of the action, we are always taking applications for Unsilenced volunteers. Whether you want to be part of our advocacy team working face-to-face with survivors through helping with independence packs, support groups, or implementing Project Speak presentations just like this throughout your community, or digging up dirt and investigating programs through surveys and research in our investigations division, creating content and doing graphic design for our social media accounts in our communications division, helping scale our impact by interviewing and onboarding new volunteers and people in culture, or have tech skills and want to help with our website and archive in our IT department. We have a place for anyone wanting to help. And now we're going to open it up for questions. Oh, yes. Also, the last question. If you are interested in getting updates about future TTI news, activism, Unsilenced related events, and also my memoir that is coming out in January or February of this next year, go ahead and put your first, last name, and your email address. It's not required, but it is the last question. Okay, so we're gonna open it up to questions. You're gonna see 4 different QR codes up there. The first is to our social media accounts. The second is to our volunteer application if you are interested. The third is to join Discord. And the fourth is our website to check it out. So go ahead and ask any questions through Mentimeter, or you're also welcome to raise your hand and ask as well. Where? Yes.
So on your on the slide with the statistics about like the funding that goes towards this industry, one thing that really stuck out to me was $588 a day per student per kid that's in this facility. What do you think that money would be best served to go to? Although I understand that's a loaded question. Like, how could you probably like what are you guys thinking is the best way to direct that money to maybe improve the condition of these kids that are going through that? Or
Well, considering most of these decision makers that are sending kids is usually going to be out of state facilities. So the first point to make is that they're taking this money, that $588 a day on average, and they're putting it into another state's economy, right? So we have that issue. If we can utilize those funds for community-based alternatives within their own community, we will not only be better serving the youth by having mental health care while we're also providing, a stable environment if they have one at home and being in the support system they need, but also, aiding those local economies as well.
So just to show you, like, that $588, most of it doesn't actually go to parents with children either. So in one example, there was an investigative journalist, his name was Thomas Houlihan, who investigated one of the largest troubled teen chains at the time called WASP. It was a big program chain that existed from the 90s throughout the late 2000s. And he found that despite spending anywhere from $3,000 to $10,000 a month, only approximately 10 to 25% directly paid for the overhead and the care of children. Rest went into the program.
No, I can't.
Budgets, and the condition that these children were in, like food was constantly
I don't have the Mentimeter thing.
neglect, they didn't have therapy, they had people who, essentially the only job opportunities they had besides looking at the program and taking care of these at-risk vulnerable children was the local Walmart, because they set up these programs in remote areas like Ogdensburg, New York, or Sanders County, Montana. If you don't know where those places are, it's okay. Most people don't. Those are places that are remote, and there's no other history except those programs that they set up. They do that on purpose because it's so insidious. No one wants to shut down the only other, possible viable employer, so they go to these places where there is no other industry and no other job opportunities, and it becomes the industry for the area. They put a lot of money into like the Chamber of Commerce and other businesses that keep them propelled forward, but it's just a money-making machine. So if you ask me, like, where would that money be better suited, it really depends on the problem, to be honest. What's so seductive about troubled teen programs is that no matter what the problem is, your kid's wearing Ozzy Osbourne shirt and listening to music you don't like, your kid's smoking weed, you're doing drugs, and by the way, the majority of kids that go to these programs, they do drugs, it's experimental. I think there was a study, another investigative study done by reporters that found that only about 10% of kids actually had serious drug problems for this program, this group of programs. But, they take these packages sitting together saying, no matter what the problem is, we have a fix. Just send your kid away and pay us money. The reality is that as, future social workers, psychologists, other things, you guys understand that psychological or, behavioral problems are more complex than that. There's no one-size-fits-all treatment to trauma, to eating disorders, to depression. You really have to be selective on how you treat those things. And some things will work for like EMDR will work on some people and won't on others. And those are things that you can find in your community without having to rip away those bonds.
Thanks, Katie.
No worries.
All right, we've got some good questions here. So why hasn't any legal legislative action been taken? Why hasn't any been taken yet if there is so much awareness of the TDI industry now, and how are they being treated? So there has been some pretty good legislative action that has occurred. Senator Gelser in Oregon has done a really good job at really shutting down the pipelines outside of Oregon. Within Utah, we have SB 127 that was passed in 2020?
Yeah,
Yep.
2021.
2021, which made it so all restraints are going to have to be given to DHHS and Office of Licensing. It's just a lot more reporting being done. And so we've seen action there. However, when speaking to Senator McCall in Utah, we see a lot of loopholes, such as what happens when a child dies? such as Taylor Goodridge, died at Diamond Ranch Academy in Hurricane, Utah on December 20th, 2022. What happens to their license when they die? There's nothing in SB 127 for that, such as an automatic revocation. We need to address those issues. It's very, very hard to regulate an industry that has been around for centuries and really built into our social framework.
A good example is some of the states have public DHS records. The way that they treat these programs of licensing or with regulation is that they treat it like it's not a systemic problem. If a kid gets abused, they just retrain the staff or fire the staff, and they don't look at the training of the staff like overall. And so you'll see if like public DHS records in Texas, these same places will be continuously getting dinged for the same thing. They just fire staff, replace them, train them the same way, it happens again.
It's whack-a-mole. You know, and even if they are able to shut down a facility because of legal action, which is, it's hard to come by. Usually it takes like a death to be able to do that. And even then it's hard, but nothing's stopping them from going into another LLC in the same building with the same staff and running just a different named program, but it's the exact same thing. So these are things that need to be addressed in the legislative way. With legal action, that is something that we are really heavily focusing on right now. We now have an attorney database, like I said, that is bridging the gap between survivor needs and being able to take legal action if needed, if they want. And we're helping facilitate litigation across the country, and it's actually starting to pick up. Like I said, it's really hard to start litigation on anything except like a death because of the way that the program operates, and you already have that troubled teen label, and it's super complicated. But litigation, in my opinion, is going to be one of the ways that we're going to be able to shut down this industry and holding programs accountable. Yes?
What was your biggest struggle with founding Unsilenced and getting your message out there?
Biggest struggle was figuring out knowing, I talk about this abuse all the time, right? I talk about the abuse that goes on, but then I also have an understanding of some people have a good time in these facilities. Some people say that it's helpful. And I think the hardest thing for me when we started Unsilenced was learning how to accept that those two, experiences can very much so be true at the same time. And learning how to talk to other people who had a good experience and not letting that trigger those that had bad experiences. But I'd say the most hard thing is not letting things get to you. We hear about a lot of abuse. We do a lot of record requests where we hear the most heinous things. 911 calls when people are dying. We hear these things, and not letting it seep into our personal life and into our own recovery and healing, and just kind of pushing past that. And then lastly is the awareness component, figuring out how do we create the social change, which is why Project Speak came up. It's about the decision makers. I come from, I've been in nonprofits my whole life. I come from a business perspective of the only way to take down an industry or any business is to steal its bottom line. So we need to affect the pipelines going into the industry and attacking the the programs currently holding the kids, but we need to prevent them from actually going in, because once enrollment rates go down, they're going to be suffering, and that, along with the PR and what we put out on social media and TikTok, is going to have the greatest change. Let's see, Katie, you want to touch on WASP?
Oh boy.
Just
have you seen
really short, but yeah.
PI program plan internationally. What is the one in Mexico? There's a lot of U.S. based programs that open up overseas. We've seen in the Czech Republic, Jamaica. There's a couple in Jamaica right now. Samoa, Mexico, Sunset Bay Academy in Mexico is open right now still. And you do see it pop up because it's less regulated in these countries. Amazingly enough, though, Mexico is actually pretty good about shutting down ones run by Americans pretty fast compared to the other countries, because they don't want, they don't want the Americans in the country just abusing kids, But other countries are pretty, open to it, and unfortunately, and we've seen them internationally. They've died down a bit because, unfortunately for them, is 2008 happened, the financial crash. the middle class has gotten smaller and smaller, so there's less private pay. So if you want to have public funding, public dollars, IEPs, foster care systems, things like that, juvenile justice, you need to have something that's in the states. So
Why don't you also answer religious-based DTI programs more difficult to expose and regulate?
yeah,
That's a great one.
They are. That's a great question. A lot of these religious programs operate under religious rights. So as far back as like the 1960s, the roll-off homes, if you guys Google that, ROLOFF homes, there were religious homes opening up for wayward children, and they turned it into a very big theatrical, political, theater where they constantly get sued. Texas, Mississippi, Missouri, trying to get regulators in to check things like just basic firefighters wanting to make sure there's no fire hazards. Nope. Religious rights, you guys don't have to regulate us. And a lot of them have gotten away with it. Meg also brought up the ICBC. ICBC regulates, kids going to RTCs, kid boarding schools, wilderness, it at least tracks them. All a religious program has to do is open it up and say, we're a boarding school. We're not a therapeutic school, but we do take care of troubled kids. Just send it to us. Don't worry about therapy. And they're not tracked by ICBC. A lot of them in states like Missouri, they don't have to get a license. They don't have to get any sort of license. They just literally changed 2 years ago in 2021 the law in Missouri just to say that they at least have to register on a site with the DSSS to let them know that they exist, because these programs, these religious programs are existing there, never had to let the state know. And state, DHS could not go in, couldn't, check on the kids. They didn't even know some of these places existed, and because of the religious freedom laws, and just couldn't shut them down.
Yeah, very good question.
At least now they know they exist in one state, but there's still so many states that, there's no tracking or anything. It's a lot harder when you're going against, this is our religious freedom. And honestly, I no judgment towards anyone's religion, but I don't think, whether you're doing it under Jesus or under the guise of psychology, child abuse is child abuse, and that you shouldn't have an exception to it regardless.
So this is probably one of the most common questions that we get, which is, are there any effective camps for troubled teens that are more therapeutic now? So in order to answer that question, we have to kind of remove the fact that some of them are abusive and just pretend that doesn't exist for a second, because we go back to what we know now about child development. The act of being removed, whether forcibly or not, and forced to grow up not around your parents or caregivers, and your support system that you have had since you were very, very young, is traumatic in and of itself. And the fact is that with the lack of regulation, the lack of reporting, the lack of oversight, with the fact that none of the actual therapy they're doing is research-backed, specifically like wilderness camp. They claim to have research, but it's paid for by them, and there's no control group and all of that. But there's really no research to show that, for instance, someone struggling with depression needs to go into a wilderness program for 6 weeks and then be transferred for 1.5 years at an RTC. There is nothing in therapy, in psychology, in psychiatry that says that that is necessary. It is always about the least restrictive measures that we could possibly get first, right? So keeping kids in their communities is the most effective thing we can do. Furthermore, the therapeutic stuff that goes on, therapy, group therapy, whatever you want to call it, actually happens at a rate that's exactly the same that you would have, actually less than, that you would get in community-based settings. So in my program, I don't know about you guys, but I saw my therapist once every week, once every 2 weeks. The group therapy was certainly not group therapy, it was attack therapy, and it was super detrimental, but one-on-one therapy happened less than you would get in a partial hospitalization program, intensive outpatient, or just seeing a therapist. So in that way, we need to get kids back into where they're the most safe environment, which is around their support systems.
I was also going to say that there are over 100 different methods for community-based treatments, depending on what the issue is, and they cost a fraction of the cost of RTCs. There's just not as much profit motive, so you don't see it marketed the same way. I think that there are some TTI programs out there that started with the best of intentions, but when you have a when you have a product and a profit motive, and you have to keep costs down in order to sustain a business or accept kids or things that in order to keep solvent or to get as much money or shareholders, no matter what happens, there's always going to be a motive to cover your own ass, pardon my French, than to second you see abuse, report it. And that's what I've seen even when places that opened with maybe the owners had good intentions, but when they come across their first abuse case, they just quietly try to fire the person and move on, and then it happens again, and it kind of becomes a slippery slope once it happens.
How can we influence people around the country to protest against these programs? That goes back to what I said of go out and talk about the troubled teen industry, tell them about unsilenced.org, share our content, follow me, follow Unsilenced both on Instagram, on TikTok. We're constantly pushing stuff out, and try to utilize the social media network, because that's really what is going to create the awareness needed. And like I said, talk to your friends, talk to your family, just keep talking about it. That's pretty much the best way that we can do that. If you have anything to answer.
Yeah, I was going to say, awareness in general helps. Like back in the 90s, we had things like Columbine happen, things like that, where we jump to this extreme where we have to, kids who are wearing black or whatever, we have to, protect society against them. But I think we've evolved to understand that, these stereotypes aren't really, a one-size-fits-all. And I think that the awareness of if you send your kid away, you're opening them up to abuse, and for parents, for that to become more socially prevalent, that people understand that, will make people think about it before they send their kids away.
Yep. And then the last one I have to say, parents are 100% manipulated, just so you know. Especially, any parent that gets on the phone with the program, they're going to be manipulated, fear-mongered, and deceived. So, okay.
All right. First, we hand round of applause for.
Stop the recording.